quorum is present. I'd like to ask Mr. Scheitel to please call the roll.
Sorry, I need a second real quick. This is not. Chair Keith Brainerd.
Here.
Robert May.
Here.
Josh McGee.
Here.
Thank you. Welcome. This is a meeting of the Actuarial Committee of the Pension Review Board. First item of business, I would entertain a motion to suspend reading of the minutes.
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Passes unanimously. We will suspend reading of the minutes. I would approve, I would consider a motion for any changes to the minutes.
None here.
If not, I would approve a motion to approve the minutes as provided.
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Minutes are approved. Texas statute directs this body to conduct actuarial reviews of issues that threaten the condition of public pension plans in the state. And that is what we have been working on in recent months. That's what we'll be focusing on during a significant portion of today's meeting. We have examined several pension plans in the last couple of months, and we're going to look at 3 more today. So again, what we're doing is based on statute, and this is a directive that's provided to this body in statute. The first plan that's on our agenda today is the Irving Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund. And I would ask Anu, the PRB Executive Director, to explain that issue for us.
Thank you, Keith, and good morning, members. Behind tab A of your meeting packet, we have included 2 letters that we received from the City of Irving, as well as Representative Anderson's office, Rodney Anderson's office, requesting that the Pension Review Board postpone the intensive actuarial review of the Irving Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund until the fall of this year. The reason behind their request was that they are in the process of conducting an actuarial valuation this year, as well as an actuarial audit, and they have made a number of changes to their system. They have made contribution rate changes, both from the city as well as the firefighters. They have updated their mortality table, as well as have proposed to update their assumed rate of return, which will be reflected in the upcoming 2017 valuation. And considering the current unique situation of the Irving Fire Fund, given they have these 2 analyses in the works, the staff determined that it would be in the best interest to postpone the review until the fall, until we receive this new information and conduct the analysis from then on. So in this review cycle, we do not have a report on Irving Fire, and we will wait until this fall to finalize their review.
Thank you. So I want to clarify one thing, or strengthen one thing that Anu said, and that is that Irving identified a series of unique factors that we took under consideration, felt that the time of this committee and of Irving would be much better spent giving them an opportunity to finish these issues and valuations before them, and so we'll take them up later this year. Any questions or comments from the members?
Only that I have a desire not to delay further. Once we get to the fall, we should make sure that we complete this prior to the legislative session so that this can be included in the materials that we provide to the legislature.
Absolutely, and we did inform the system as well as the city that we will be targeting this fall to finalize the review as well as include the review in our biennial report for the legislature.
Other comments or questions on Irving? Thank you. Next, behind tab B of your packet is information pertaining to the Beaumont Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund. I'd like to ask the PRB staff actuary, Kenny Herbold, to come forward, and please present your report. Welcome.
Good morning, members. My name is Kenny Herbold. I'm the Pension Review Board Staff Actuary. As Mr. Brainerd said, behind tab B, we have the intensive review that we performed for Beaumont Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund. I just would like to point out that we highlighted three primary issues. One of those is the asset liability mismatch with respect to their post-retirement optional plan, some governance issues, and some funding risks that we raised. With respect to the prop, the primary issue is that this is an extremely short-term liability that offers basically a 6% guaranteed rate of return, and has for the past 10 years since it was introduced. There are very few restrictions on when this money can be taken out. And specifically, I'd like to refer you to page 4 of the review. There is a graph at the bottom of the page that has shown how this account balance has grown. So just to give a quick overview, basically the prop is an opportunity for members who receive a drop distribution, so a deferred retirement option distribution plan distribution, to roll over that lump sum back into the plan, as well as an opportunity for retirees to defer their annuity payments into the plan. So they can do this essentially for 20 years before they're required to start making a distribution. So the distribution requirements aren't hit until the IRS required minimum distribution rules come into play. They do have the opportunity to take the full lump sum out at any point in time, or they can take it out with some restrictions on annual distributions, but they can take a partial lump sum, they can take a full lump sum. So again, this is an extremely short-term liability that offers a 6% guaranteed rate of return. And so we felt that it presents some unique risks that don't seem to be supported. It's not, if you look at the growth from 2007 to 2016, it started out as 3% of total assets. It's now almost a third of their total assets. So if for some unforeseen reason people decide to start withdrawing tomorrow, it would be a significant drain on a plan that's already significantly underfunded. Right now they have, I believe they are close to about 45% funded. So that's one of, again, so all of these issues do interact with one another. So none of this is in a vacuum, obviously. So we have that concern with the guaranteed rate of return. They are less than 50% funded and have been for a significant period of time. Part of the issue comes from the fact that they have a fixed rate contribution that which is common for most Telfer plans, but it's lower than their 30-year actuarially determined contribution, and has been in most years. Now I do want to point out that we're using this 30-year open amortization as a reference for an ADC, primarily because it's been consistently calculated for an extended period of time and it's readily available. It's not something that would be recommended as a funding policy to begin with, primarily because it results in perpetual negative amortization. So meaning if you chose to contribute at that rate, you would never actually pay off your unfunded accrued liability. It's simply there as an easy benchmark, not necessarily as a recommendation for a contribution policy. And you'll notice that in the appendix we do, on page 9, we do show that their actual 10-year rates of return have been significantly lower than their chosen assumed rate of return. which was another issue. And finally, from a governance perspective, again, the example that we raised was with respect to the drop program, more specifically the prop. If you look at the timeline on page 6, you can see that they did introduce a retroactive drop back in 1993, and for an extended period of time, that retroactive drop does not include, they introduced a forward drop and then shifted to a retroactive drop, but this doesn't include any interest on those payments. In 2006 is when they introduced the prop. This was a time where we were having historically low interest rates and had for an extended period of time. At that point, it was simply drop rollovers, but then in 2010, they allowed all distributions to be deferred into the plan, and that was at a point in time where their 10-year rate of return was below 3%. So it, basically we're highlighting that there are some concerns with how decisions are being made and when they're being made. So the conclusions that we have drawn for this particular review is that we have suggested that the plan conduct an in-depth asset liability study to understand the risks that the prop is posing, and look a little bit closer to see what, if something needs to be done and considered. One thing I didn't mention, they did acknowledge that there could be some concern with that guaranteed rate of return and changed the assumed rate of return. However, the change only applies to employees hired after 1/1/2017, which there's a 20-year requirement for retirement, so that means that it will have absolutely no impact on anyone participating in the prop for the next 20 years, and it wouldn't be until 2037 where the first individual would be eligible for that reduced rate of interest. And then finally, we suggested that they develop a coordinated funding benefit investment policy that kind of lays out a more formal risk-sharing policy with respect to changes for both good times and bad times.
Chairman.
Thank you, Kenny. Bob?
Turn it on.
Yeah, right over there. Yep, thank you.
As I'm hearing you talk about their situation, it seems to me it has some characteristics similar to the Dallas Fire and Police system that we spent a lot of time, and the legislature spent a lot of time last session. Am I missing something here when I say it seems like this is that I've heard this before in a general way?
There are certainly a number of characteristics that are similar to Dallas Police and Fire Plan, specifically a low funded ratio and a high guaranteed rate of return on the prop account balances.
And given the history we have with Dallas and that the legislature has, I think that's something we want to be aware of, and you're making us aware of it. But I'm concerned. I for many years that plan was not on our concern issue, and now they are.
Kenny, for the benefit of the audience, could you please briefly describe the difference between a garden variety drop such that Dallas had and this drop in this case, please?
Certainly. There's a couple of different pieces that make this different. So the Dallas Police and Fire has a forward drop, meaning a retiree must make a positive election while working to retire on paper and defer their annuity into an account balance for themselves. And then they earned a rate of return on those payments on that account balance. They also have the opportunity to defer that, not take a distribution when they actually retired and separated service. From this perspective, what Beaumont has now, they have a retroactive drop, which means when you actually separate service, you can be treated as if you retired at an earlier date, and you receive the annuity payments that the accumulated annuity payments that you would have received if you had retired on that date. Now, we're not raising any particular issues with the retroactive drop because there is no interest accumulation on those payments. And if you look back at the history, there did not appear to be any funding issues. Those particular payments appear to be reasonably predictable, and there are no, it's like offering a lump sum essentially as a payment option. With respect to the difference here is that with a post-retirement option plan, they are allowing retirees to take money that they would have received and removed from the plan and defer it, leave it in the plan essentially, and earn a guaranteed 6%. On paper, if you have an assumed rate of return of 8% and you're paying out a rate of 6%, it appears that it is a positive benefit. However, if you are paying out 6% and you're not earning 6% or more, you are losing money on that account balance.
And that balance is payable on demand by the member, is that correct?
Correct.
Josh, did you have questions?
So on this drop issue, it's very interesting to me the way that drops have evolved, at least in the state of Texas. So you use the term garden variety drop. I'm not sure if that's a term of art in the pension world. But drops were intended to be a mechanism by which people could delay retirement once they reach normal retirement age. So you want to keep working. There's a strong financial incentive to leave. If you continue working, you're losing out on a pension year. And so drop was meant to mitigate that problem. In Texas, somehow they've evolved to something that is a guaranteed savings account once you have retired. And often that guarantee in Dallas and in this situation is quite high. Dallas was much higher for a period of time. Houston has had a similar issue with drop balances, although they limited what you could defer into those plans. But it's just very interesting from a policy perspective how quickly, whenever you turn a deferred retirement option into a guaranteed savings account, it can cause problems for the plan and can end up eroding very quickly the core benefit for members. And that's just something that should be on our minds whenever we look at these plans.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a point well taken, and I should not have referred to Dallas as an example of a garden variety drop because it had some serious flaws. Other comments or questions
Anita,
for
just
Kenny?
a question. I think I may have misspoken. I thought we were comparing it to Dallas, but we're comparing this is our next one on the list that we're talking about.
No, up to this point, we've been comparing it to Dallas.
Okay.
So we're still on Beaumont, but Dallas is perhaps the most recent drop issue that we were talking about, and so he was just comparing Dallas's with City of Beaumont's. Yes, sir.
So I'd like to highlight three things. So first is this prop issue. I think another thing that should be on our radar is in situations where pension boards have a fiduciary duty to manage the fund to the benefit of beneficiaries. So they're supposed to make sure the money can be paid when due. And they have some control over benefit levels. That seems to be a relatively confused incentive situation where there's a conflict between controlling benefit levels and making sure that there's enough money in the fund to pay benefits when due and that it's maintained in a sustainable, cost-effective way. I'd just like to highlight that, and that should be on our radar as a governance issue that we should be aware of and probably should make the legislature aware of. I don't know that I don't know of too many examples where we couldn't look in where there is this situation where we wouldn't question some of the decisions that were made. Certainly, expanding the prop program in 2010 at the kind of nadir of the Great Recession is probably not the best decision to make, and it clearly had implications for the funding level of the plan, and that just raises a lot of questions in my mind. The guaranteed return, so the plan's assumed return is 8%, and the guaranteed return in prop is 6%. Both are problematic whenever I look at the 10-year annualized returns. I don't see a single 10-year period over these 12 years. So we've got 12 10-year periods that we're looking at here, and none of them touch the 8%, and only a third of them touch the 6%. If I were on that board, that would raise some serious questions to me about actuarial assumptions and the return that we're promising in the prop account. That would set off alarm bells for me that we are over a sustained period of time not meeting our actuarial assumptions, and so something's got to give. It would be less concerning to me if I looked at the contributions going into the plan and the contributions from the employer were matching the ADC, but I see a greater than 5% of payroll gap between the required contribution to actually sustain the plan and close the funding gap. Well, actually, it's not even to close the funding gap because we're using open. An ADC that is a low bar, I see a more than 5% of payroll gap between a low bar ADC and what's actually being put into the plan. Combination of those things is very concerning. The last thing I'll highlight, there's not information in this report about asset allocation. We might consider just adding that back into the appendix. In previous reports, we'd had that. But it would be very interesting to look at asset allocation. You said that the plan should do an asset liability study. I think the plan should really take a close look at their assumed return, look at the risk they're taking on the asset side. One thing I do notice is that the expense percent as a percent of assets is higher than most of their peers, and performance appears to be quite a bit lower than most of their peers. Again, this is a cause for concern. I don't have enough information to really say what's going on there, but as summary information, again, that sets off alarm bells for me that the trajectory of this plan does not appear to be going in a positive direction, and the policies that are being enacted by the board do not seem to be rectifying the situation quickly enough.
I agree with your concerns. And I noticed you mentioned earlier, particularly the year 2015, I believe you said was a year where things happened, material things happened. I don't know whether you can say anything more about it than that.
I'm not sure I mentioned 2015, but 2010 is when they shifted from the prop allowing annuity payments being deferred into the prop accounts.
Okay.
Other comments or questions for the staff actuary? If not, I'd like to, Kenny, thank you. I'd like to invite representatives of the City of Beaumont and the Beaumont Fireman's Plan to please come forward.
Members, just a quick note, also included in your meeting packet is the response from the plan, a letter essentially addressing the risk concerns we have raised.
Thank you. Would each of you please identify yourselves and the position you hold?
Brian Hebert, Chair on the board.
Chuck Campbell, attorney for the fund with Jackson Walker.
My name is Brad Heinrichs. I'm an actuary with Foster & Foster.
My name's Jack Evett. I'm the Plans Investment Consultant with Anco Consulting.
Sorry, I'd also like to introduce, we do have our two other elected members on the board, Carl Whitehead and William Cheshire, and the other board member, he's Chief Financial Officer, Todd Simon.
Welcome. Thank you all for coming out. Are any of you prepared to deliver prepared remarks? Or do you just wish to take Q&A?
I would just like to make a statement as far as what we've seen. I believe we've been in the process this entire time addressing these issues, being proactive. I think you'll see we're pretty active as a board in decision making. TELFRA, as far as our education certifications, we do take that very serious. I think you may see that going forward.
Thank you. Are all four of you representatives of the plan? Any of you with the city, on the payroll of the city? You are, sir. Thank you. I'm sorry, I missed your name, sir.
Todd Simino.
Thank you. And you're the CFO with the city?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Questions for the gentleman before us? Josh?
I'd just like to say thanks for coming. It's great that you guys brought such a large contingent. And I should say that even though I'm concerned by the report that we saw here and the trajectory of the plan and would urge swifter action, it is a good sign that you guys take this seriously and so many of you came today and from such a broad array of experiences with the plan. And I agree that this is an indication of a more proactive board. So that is a great indication. However, we're waiting to see some real results here. Proof is in the pudding on this one.
Yes.
And it looks like this has been in a state where the trajectory has been negative for quite some time. As I said, this would have set alarm bells off for me. And I'm just trying to get a sense from you all, kind of what you think the next steps are. So what are the next steps for you, and how are you trying to address this?
I think the next step, and I addressed it in the response, we're in the process, or will be in the process this year, to do our actuarial audit. We've been looking at that, and I think with our asset allocation, what we've done, we've made changes to the fund, especially since I believe it's like 2013, changes, fund management changes, not just the asset, but making sure we have the right fund managers in place. And
You mean to address that
Please.
specifically? You're correct. There's been a lot of changes, and I don't know that in a plan like this, I think they're all immediately apparent. You referenced the trajectory. I think that we recognized that there were some challenges ahead in 2013. We made some very substantial changes both to the asset allocation for the plan and the managers in the plan, specifically to better prepare the plan for the future, and not being willing to set stagnant with where we were. Just for your reference, we actually made, since that time, we've made 11 specific manager changes. And this is to twofold. To replace managers that we felt like maybe had been in the plan for a long time and weren't really delivering the types of investment results that we were expecting from managers in those mandates, as well as to explore asset classes that maybe provided better opportunity for the future. I think the low interest rate environment was referenced a couple of times earlier. Certainly that's a challenge for plans like this, but to better prepare the investments for that type of environment, which is very different than maybe what we'd seen prior to that. So it's been a very dynamic process. The overall asset allocation of the plan has changed as well. This plan had a very static, as most plans did for a very long period of time. In fixed income, generally core fixed income has been the challenge. We've made a concerted effort to reduce the exposure to core fixed income and look for other areas to provide things that fixed income had provided for us historically, such as a high level of income, and not necessarily provide the risk and return characteristics that fixed income has actually today.
Sir, have you produced a projected return for this fund based on the asset allocation it has right now over the next, say, 20 or 30 years?
We've done it for longer than that. 20 or 30 years, we've actually done it. We believe in, and I think it's in the response that we provided, a mix of returns, and you can see, maybe it's not all in there, that we think that expectations for the future for a plan that's allocated in this way should meet the expected actuarial return assumption over a long period of time. And we don't have I don't have with me the specifics of what that might be as far as an absolute number. We do forecast out certain asset classes into the future. We don't forecast out all of the asset classes into the future, and I think you do have that information. The plan's asset allocation is actually significantly broader than kind of what you see on the first page of the response that we provided.
Thank you. And I missed your last name, Brad.
My last name is Heinrichs.
Heinrichs, thank you. Have you advised the plan on its investment return assumption?
Yeah, our firm believes that the advice on the investment return assumption is a collaborative effort with the investment consultant, because the guy to my left knows a whole lot more about the portfolio than I do. I should start by saying, my experience with the fund only goes back to 2012, late 2012. One of the first things that we did when we came on board, I think we performed this in 2013, I believe, Brian, was we did an experience study, which I was told had not ever been done before, or at least not for a really long time. And so we didn't just look at the investment return assumption. We looked at all the assumptions, and the I advised the board along with Mr. Evett here on that assumption, and given the research that I think that Jack put together, that 8% was justifiable. Would a lower number certainly make us all feel a little bit better? Sure, no doubt. We did make some changes, or the board did vote to make a few changes to become more conservative. First and foremost was the payroll growth assumption. We were assuming that the payroll of the department was going to grow. The prior actuary was assuming 4%. And if you were to look at the experience, they hadn't gotten 4%, and that has a profound effect, as Mr. May would be able to tell you, on the amortization period. And so we lowered that to 3.5. I think that in future evaluations, we're going to push to lower that even further. 8% is certainly, if you look nationwide, you'd probably see that 8% is on the higher end of what you see at this point. And for most of our 400 clients, we are a little south of 8%. But when I say a little south of 8%, I'm not talking 6%. It's somewhere in the 7.5 range to 7 3/4. I think the national average is still around 7 3/4 or so. And so to answer your question, yes, we did analysis along with ANDCO back then. It's certainly an assumption that we're going to continue to dive into. But I've been impressed, and I said we work for almost 400 funds nationwide. I have been impressed with the board's proactiveness, if that's a word, when it comes to their investment policies. They've also encouraged the unions in the city to increase their contribution rates. Do I think that there's going to be more to come? Absolutely. If I was to predict whether or not we were going to be in a situation where we may need to do a funding restoration plan, as you guys call it, I think that under the next actuarial report, it's likely that we will. And as you know, when that process gets in motion, then more changes come about, and I would expect that to happen. But absent that, the board still has made a lot of changes to try to improve their investment performance. And I think that Mr. McGee, your comment, saying it a different way, I think is dead on, which is, when you have a guaranteed return on prop balances. Now, and one of the big distinctions between here and Dallas is that this guarantee is less than our assumption by a couple percent. It's not the same. What it does is it just puts extra pressure on our investment performance. If we earn 8% over the long term, I think we'd all agree, if we're having access to the money actually is a benefit to the fund over the long term. But it certainly adds more pressure, and if we don't earn 6, we're losing out on all of those monies. There's no doubt about it. So I think Mr. Herbold was right in his in raising the flag to say, okay, this is something that needs to be looked at. I think the board understands it and is going to continue to monitor it, and they may make changes to it, especially whenever the restoration plan starts.
Mr. Heinrichs, when was the 8% return assumption set or last reviewed?
Well, the last formal review was our experience study, which was 4+ years ago.
So maybe around 2013?
Around 2013. I can probably get you the exact date.
That's okay. So at that time, the prop balance as a percentage of the fund's assets was about half of what it is now.
Exactly.
And so now the plan is approaching nearly 30% nearly one-third, and if the trend continues, I think we'll probably see one-third of the fund's assets are going to be callable at any time.
That's right.
Do actuarial standards of practice require, when setting the actuarial assumption, the actuary to consider the required liquidity?
It's certainly something that among many other factors that should be considered. And in my consultation with the fund's investment consultant, and I'd love to hear your comments here, his view, I'm speaking for you and then you just tell me if I'm wrong, his view at the time, and I think continues to be, that liquidity, the perceived liquidity issues are overblown and that there isn't a liquidity problem. But I'll listen to Jack.
Okay.
Is that because we're offering a guaranteed 6% and someone would be crazy to take their money out? I'm sorry, I'm not trying to make light of it.
Well, the reality is that is actually proven to be true, but no, that's actually not the case.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to speak for you, and I didn't mean to make light of it.
No, I understood. So my experience kind of going back to 2013 is that's when we really reviewed the investment return assumption. And that's when we made a lot of changes to the plan. I think there's a lot of things that you can do when you talk about your investment mix and what the expectation is that you're going to earn. And there's a couple of different things that you can do. You don't just have to lower your investment return assumption. You can actually change your asset mix, and you can also reduce your cost as ways to improve your overall investment net investment experience. So we've done a lot of those things. I think the investment returns, since we've done that, which goes back to 6 years ending 12/31, we have a net return over 8.5%.
I'm sorry, when was the start date on that? Since when?
Since 6 years ending 17.
Thank you.
12/31 of 17, we have a net return of over 8.5%. Now, the market certainly helped us with that. But we've also made a lot of changes as well that should have also benefited us as well. So up to this point, the things that we enacted in 2013 have worked. Now, as far as liquidity is concerned, I think there's a reference to liquidity in the intensive actuarial review that states that liquidity is less than 3% of the plan. I think that depends on your definition of liquidity. If you're talking about cash in the plan, you're correct. We don't really manage the plan to hold a lot of cash, particularly not nearly 30% of the plan in cash. But liquid investments mean how quickly can we turn what we have into cash if we need to make distributions. The reality is that we would say that the plan maintains liquidity in the neighborhood of 97.5%, 98%, as far as our ability to convert what we have into what we need. That's very different. I know there was a reference made to the similarities between Dallas Police and Fire and this plan. This is a definite distinction. This is not the same thing. We have 98% of the plan that we can have liquid cash in a week.
What is your inflation assumption, sir?
2.5%. Well, my inflation assumption in the forecasting information that we use is 2.5%. Is that?
We follow
We're
that,
using the value,
2.5,
yeah.
which is relatively low if you were to compare across other consultants.
Thank you. Other questions for these gentlemen?
Yes, we earlier mentioned that the city is also represented here today, not at the table, but I'm just wondering if the city would like to say something about their work with and their connection with the board of the fund.
Right, so I'm the current CFO with the city. I've been on the board for about 1.5 years. I've been with the city for 13 years, and during my whole 13 years, the CFO for the city has been active on all the board meetings that are monthly. I go to the training, whether it's 2 to 3 times a year. Also, another person from the city serves on the board, goes to all the meetings. It was the Director of Human Resources, now it's the City Controller. So we participate in all the board meetings, we go to the training with them, and just keep current. That's why we're...
Typically, it's one from the city on the board.
Sir?
One person on the board, two, I'm sorry.
Right.
Mr. Semino, thank you for being here. In 2016, the city's contribution was 5% less than the actuarially determined contribution. Is the city committed to increasing its contribution to meet the ADC?
Well, the way we've done it in the past, it's all tied to the collective bargaining agreement. It's a fixed rate based on the percentage of pay. And so it's always been equal to the fireman's input. So, like I said, it was 13% on both sides. It was increased to 15% on both sides. Now it's 15.5% on both sides. So it's always been a fixed rate. It hasn't been, based on the APC.
Okay, that sounded like a no.
That's correct.
Does that trouble anybody here, that there's no commitment to paying the actuarially determined contribution?
This is Chuck Campbell, Jackson Walker, attorney for the fund. I mean, from a reminder, from a Telford plan perspective, it is a fixed rate with respect to, the statutory construction provides for a fixed rate to be provided. The city provides a match of what the firefighters provide up to 12%. Anything above 12%, the city, whatever, they're not legally required to contribute above 12%. Beaumont City has worked with the fire department and worked with, in terms of the last two agreements, and have increased contributions. There's been 2 increases since 2012 in terms of getting contributions where they need to be. Obviously, that process, and Brian can speak to when the next time that process, but I know it's coming up, and I'm sure it'll be something that is discussed and on the table. But that's from a governance perspective and from a legal perspective, that's where the contribution rates are, why they're set where they are, and how they move forward. There's not.
I think Mr. Brainerd's larger point is right now benefits costs are well above what the agreed to contribution rates are. And we are concerned that there's nobody on the other side that's willing to sufficiently increase contributions to actually make up that deficit, which means this plan is destined for a slow slide unless the board takes additional action. So I think if I were in your shoes, I would be concerned, and it would prompt me pretty significantly towards action and to help the city understand what they need to do and to be part of a solution to this.
And I would just respond from that perspective. I think, and the chair can speak to it more, but the board has been involved as it can be. The board can't set the contribution rates and can't make the city or the firefighters do what they do. Their job is to inform. At the last 2 periods when that has arisen, when contribution rates have been discussed, they've been at the table and have been informing. And Brian can talk to more detail about that, but that's been something that has been on the table and that there has been involvement with it. So it's not.
In the contract before our current one in 2012, it was the CBA for 2012 to 2015. We actually had, based on our 2010 evaluation, we saw the trend. The fire department, we were at 15, if I remember correctly. The firefighters were at a 15%. We brought the city in and Local 399 in with Mr. Finlaw from Rudd & Wisdom, and he briefed and gave the information, and with that, I believe that helped increase the city's contribution from the 13 to 15. In the current contract from 15 to 2020, we advised as far as an increase in contributions would be nice to have. It actually came in with a match. If the firefighters went up 0.5%, the city would go up 0.5%, and that's where we're at 15.5. Now, obviously, we'll take this information with a collective bargaining coming up in 2020. The good thing is by having the two, the chief financial officer and the comptroller on the board too, they're aware of where we're at, making that recommendations on the future contract negotiations is. And you'll see too, we also made those benefit requests. We've also tightened up our disability standards and made, based on our actuary, things that we needed to address.
Thank you. Did you want to say something else, sir?
I just would, from a fiduciary perspective and as counsel, and I hope that message has come across from both on investments and with respect to actuarial funding, with respect to contributions. This board's engaged in has been looking at a lot of the issues that was raised in the report. That was well done and is taking him seriously.
We appreciate hearing that, truly, thank you. And as Mr. McGee said, the fact that several of you showed up says a lot about the plan. Does the plan have a funding policy?
As far as as contribution rates or the actual benefit?
Well, an articulation of how the plan will reach full funding.
No.
Thank you.
No, and can I speak to that?
Please.
Sure. As the actuary, and this typically for variable contribution rate plans, you absolutely have a funding policy, right? You define exactly how you're going to go about it. And with the fixed contribution rate plans, as Chuck mentioned, we don't have, the board has no control over the contribution. It's almost the opposite of what I consider to be a standard plan or typical plan, where the board controls what the contributions need to be on an annual basis and has no control over the benefits. It's the opposite here.
So
where the board's control is actually more over the benefit structure than it is the contribution. We take a defined set of contributions and then figure out how to manage those and that amount of money to pay off pensions to members.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm sure that you all took note of the graph in the staff analysis titled Funded Ratio Projections Based on Alternative Investment Return Scenarios on page 10. And what it shows in a nutshell is that based on 15% contribution rate, roughly, from both employees and employers, and hitting your 8% over the next 30 years, your funding level basically does not change.
Oh, yeah.
In my opinion, and it's just my opinion, but a plan ought to be moving toward full funding. And if it's not, there ought to be a plan for getting there. But in my opinion, staying at a funding level of 65% or so into perpetuity should not be acceptable. And I'm hopeful that the City of Beaumont and this board will consider that.
Absolutely.
I'll add a point to that. If your funding policy, if the money going into the plan simply maintains your current funding level, the next recession is going to happen at some point, and you're just going to see a ratcheting of unfunded liabilities and cost because you're not making any headway on the principal balance here. It's just like paying the minimum on a credit card, and that's exactly what is happening with this plan. We are 10 plus years, we're going on 10 years past the last recession. I can't tell you when the next one's going to be, but it's going to come at some point. It's not going to be roses forever. The last 10 years since the downturn have been really good in the market, have been very good in the market. I appreciate that you talked about your returns over the last 6-year period, but it would be great to compare that to the median for public plans, compare that to a 60-40 mix S&P and bond. Everything was good over that period. So it's a little bit, it's a little bit of cherry picking to say over the last 6 years we got this, when I'm looking at a lot of evidence that over any 10-year period I choose, you didn't get anywhere close to the 8%. So I look at your investment performance, I look at the report, and I don't see a whole lot of justification for an assumed rate of return which plays right into the contribution rate that you're telling the city needs to make and that your plan members need to make to actually make good on the promises that are accruing in this plan. I look at 30-year open amortization. I look at a lot of the choices, and I say you're setting a very low bar for what it takes to actually meet the obligations that the city and the plan are taking on to plan members. And there is a substantial amount of risk, downside risk here, that is pretty scary. And I appreciate that there are changes being made, but a couple of big movers here that I haven't heard you guys say that need to be changed. One is that you're even though you're out of step with the majority of public plans in the country, you want to keep the 8%. You don't want to think about lowering that. I didn't hear everybody say, hey, we're thinking about lowering that, when the most sophisticated plans in the country are trying to bring that down as quickly as possible. I also didn't hear, hey, maybe we should look at the guaranteed return for current members and bring that down a little bit. That seems like a big mover to me now, that a big source of risk in the plan now that it's about a third of plan assets. I didn't hear anything about that. I heard some tweaks around the edges, and it's great that you guys are doing a series of tweaks, and there may be some stuff hidden under the hood that we don't see, but I don't hear in this conversation an acknowledgement that the trajectory is negative and it may take some big action here to really rectify the situation. And I don't hear that acknowledgement or a real sense of honesty about how big a challenge that might be and what it might take to get there.
Can I address a couple of your points there? You mind? So we do, I would argue that the last 10 years hasn't been great for everything. It's definitely been below average for fixed income, which has historically been a very substantial portion of plans like this. So it hasn't necessarily been set it and forget it based on where you were historically to get you to where you got to historically. And so has the equity markets definitely helped? They have. One of the things that there's a lot of reference to 10-year time periods. We actually returned data that goes back to 12/31 of 1983. Net plan return is 8.71% during that period of time. So that's not a 10-year period. It's a much longer period than that. And so there's definitely shorter term challenges when you look at market environments and what has happened, and I think it's very endpoint sensitive. So if you look at it, I think there was a reference made in the material to a period beginning in 2000, which I believe is like a 16 or 17 year period. If you included the 3 prior years to that and made it a 20-year period, I think the number has changed dramatically. And so you talked about cherry picking and information. I do think that does go both ways to a certain extent on that.
Can I just say, anything that includes the late 90s is going to look super awesome.
Well, anything that includes the early 2000s and the recession in 2009 is going to look terrible.
I think that is correct. I think that what is difficult for me to square is that, yes, if you include the late 90s, everything looks great. The late 90s, you could look at investment returns over all of human history, and the late 90s was historic. It was off the charts historic in terms of returns. We still had reasonably high interest rates. It was just easier then. I look at the performance of the plan now, the recent performance of the plan, and don't see a ton of evidence that we're getting back up to where we need to be based on assumptions, which just means whenever you have a high assumed rate of return and you're not hitting it, just means contributions need to go up. I would be a lot more comfortable if contributions had some room to go up. It's a significant risk, and we're debating rate of return whenever there doesn't appear to be a lot of appetite for increasing contributions, even to match a low bar ADC. And I think there is significant risk that going forward we miss the 8% return over a substantial amount of time. I'm basing that on go forward projections, capital market projections that I see that other plans are producing that don't have too dissimilar asset mix than you all do. I just don't see a whole lot of evidence that would lead me to believe that you all are somehow an outlier and are going to be able to hit this whenever the majority of plans that I look at and a lot of sophisticated plans are going in the opposite direction and trying to go there pretty quickly. Now, most of these plans are not lowering to 6. They're trying to get down between 7 and 7.5. And that would give me a lot of confidence if you acknowledge 8's going to be tough to hit and that we should think about lowering the rate of return. That's not admitting defeat, but what I'm hearing is 8's completely defensible and we don't even, our asset mix is going to hit it, and if you look at the past and include the 90s, we get there. Well, so that worries me.
If that's the impression that you got, I'm sorry, because that's not the impression that you should get, because we do look at that frequently, and that is something that is constantly being evaluated. The investment return assumption, I think, is 8 harder to hit today than it was before. Absolutely, right? It is going to be harder in the future. It's tough to tell, maybe in the immediate term for sure. But that's something that I think is always something that's being evaluated and something that's up for consideration. So to think that we're sitting here today saying that 8% is a number that we're stuck with and we're going to sit with is just not the case. It's something that is absolutely being evaluated, as are all of the assumptions and the investments in the plan as we go forward.
Let me, if you don't mind.
Please.
Okay. And as the actuary, with many of our plans, we've lowered the assumed rate of return. And would I love it to be 7.5? Sure, no doubt. But at the same time, and I'm not an investment professional, but to me, it's sort of like, well, if you say 8%, that's clearly not right. But 7.5, yeah, that's it. I mean, it's 0.5%. It's not. Now, would I feel better about 7.5 than 8? Sure. it's more conservative. But 7.5, 8, those are pretty. It's a pretty tight corridor there. But let me just put some more perspective around this. While I agree with what you guys are saying about, to some extent, that the trajectory isn't what I would like either as the actuary, but let's also be aware that this plan is not under the guise of a funding restoration plan at this point. They haven't had 2 consecutive actuarial evaluations with amortization periods above 40. They're really 2.5% of pay per year away from 40. And they're about 4.5% of pay per year away from 30. There are several relatively small types of benefit changes that might be considered that could get them right back on the tracks. And from an assumptions perspective, at least since I've been on board, we've worked with them to try to become a little bit more conservative. We left the 8% alone, but we took another assumption that has quite a bit of significance in a fixed rate plan, which is the payroll growth, and lowered it. I want it to go further still, but we're taking baby steps. I understand you would prefer that they be giant steps, but balancing the different stakeholders and the views of the board, we've gone where we've gone, and I think they'll be continued to make continuous steps in the future.
I appreciate that. Can I just add
Josh.
one bit? So I appreciate that acknowledgement. And that's really what I'm looking for, is that I don't think anybody on this committee wants giant steps.
Yeah.
We just want an acknowledgement that, hey, there are some big moving pieces here that are not in line with where they need to be, and we need to start walking those to a place where they're in better alignment. The reason that I am so concerned with the discount rate is I don't actually enjoy having a conversation about, your crystal ball is better than my crystal ball.
Right.
I think that's a silly conversation, as you kind of hinted at.
Right.
I care because the higher that is, the higher the probability that you're going to fall short. And there's just a lot of risk there at 8%. And that's the conversation we need to have. You guys correctly said that you can't force the city to pay more. And that's exactly right. Your job is to provide information, and I am arguing that the information you are providing is not wholesome enough to push them to understand the gravity of the situation. I don't know that it's. I don't attend your board meetings. I don't know what's discussed at the board meetings. But from what I'm seeing here, I would like to see more of a push to say, hey, we've got to come down on this discount rate. That has implications for our funded ratio. It has implications for cost. We need to go there over some period of time. We likely need to go there over some period of time. Let's talk about what the implications are of that. That's the conversation that I think really needs to happen. And you guys need to have that completely out in the open with your board, with your members, with the city soon. And you may be having that already, but it doesn't give me, the reason I get worked up is it doesn't give me a ton of confidence whenever you come here and say 8%'s fine, and that's kind of we're taking steps and 8%'s fine, and I don't hear a whole lot of move in that direction or acknowledgement that that is a conversation that needs to happen. That raises real worries in my head.
Other comments or questions from the committee? Bob?
Yes, just following up on what we've been talking about. On the contribution side, it's certainly important to keep the city fully involved in this. It's also important to keep the membership of the fund involved in this. It's important to keep in mind that just as benefits in good times moved up, benefits may have to go down. I think a number of our plans, and perhaps yours is in this group, we need more money. Let's see if the city will give us more money, and if the city says no, we just keep going with it. And it needs to be a broader way of looking at this that includes the firefighters, the city. It includes a possible need to lower benefits in some way for some parts of the total group. It's a broader issue here, just as a broader group of things moved you up to where you are.
Thank you. Give you a chance at the last word.
I think a lot of the things that y'all have addressed, we have discussed and will be discussing, especially with the review that we've had. I think that is something that I'm pretty positive we've hit on all of those issues. Lowering the assumption rate, payroll growth, it's kind of like, which one do you want to do? Which one are you able to do without throwing? And it's kind of like the assumption where if you can show the 8, but payroll growth, and that was the thing that we concentrated on. The 4, it's like we can't show that at all, at least on the 8%, the assumption rate. We have some historical data and projections going forward. We feel like the 8 is attainable, but the payroll growth, and that's why we, with the recommendation on the actuary, that's something we needed to address with that experience study. And we are looking at all the options as a board, so.
Thank you all. We appreciate you coming up and providing your thoughts and testimony. The PRB and especially the staff are happy to be of assistance if they may, and feel free to communicate with us if you'd like. But thanks very much for coming to Austin today.
Thank you very much.
We appreciate it.
Anything else from staff on this, Anu? If not, I would entertain a motion to finalize the draft intensive review of the Beaumont Firemen's Relief and Retirement Fund and to present to the full board for final review at its next meeting.
Can I request just 2 relatively minor changes to this? I would love to have I think it's important to highlight the ADC in the main body, just so it's can be compared to actual contribution rates. And then it would be nice to have in the appendix the asset allocation information that you guys have. Thank you.
So with those as an amendment, would you like to move the
Thank you.
review?
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
I move that we finalize the report as amended for presentation to the full board.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Passes. Thank you very much. Next item on the agenda is a review under the same circumstances of the Marshall Firemen's Relief and Retirement Fund. And I would again ask Kenny, please, to come forward.
Thank you, members. I will try and be a bit more brief in my comments this go around. So behind tab C, you'll find the intensive actuarial review for Marshall Firemen's Relief and Retirement Fund. We highlighted 2 specific risks, those being funding and governance. With respect to the funding risks, they're very similar that we have seen with the other plans that we've reviewed so far. They have a fixed rate contribution. Their funded ratio has been, in this particular case, no more than 55% for the past 15 years, and typically closer to the low 40s. They're, I believe, around 42% right now. As I said, their fixed rate contribution, they have a fixed rate contribution that has been lower than the 30-year open actually determined contribution. And again, I'll reiterate that it's not designed. That is not designed as a funding policy. It's simply as a point of reference. If you will look at their growth in their unfunded accrued liability, it is primarily due to the contribution being less than the normal cost and interest on the unfunded, which happens to be more. That amount happens to be more than the 30-year rolling contribution as well as their actual investments below the assumed rate of return. So they haven't been hitting their assumed rate of return, which was 8% through 2012. They did lower it to 7 3/4 in 2012, and most recently they've lowered it to 7.5% that will be effective for their 2018 actual valuation. With respect to governance, we did note that they have been increasing. They have increased their employer contribution somewhat, but there have not been any benefit changes or employee contribution increases. However, the employer contribution was increased in 2010, and there were expected increases above and beyond that through 2016 because it was originally tied to their TMRS. They decided to tie it to the TMRS contribution rate, but shortly after that in 2012, they reduced the contributions to a fixed rate back down to 1905. So originally they were supposed to raise it, they had projected to raise it to a little bit over 20%, and that's just the employer piece. And it's now sitting at a fixed 19.05%, so it's now a fixed rate. We did receive, they are subject to the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan. We did receive a response to that, and that's included in your board packet. I would note that everything included in here is still contingent on other actions from individuals besides the board. They are putting some benefit reductions for future hires to the members, and they are recommending contribution increases to the city council. But again, all of those are contingent on someone else acting and approving any of those changes. One thing that it's not clear to me, I'm not entirely sure, and this is probably a question for the actuary or the plan. The FSRP appears to be based on their 2016 actuarial valuation assumptions, which is 7 3/4 discount rate. So I'm not sure if that takes into this, the FSRP, so all the changes that they have proposed does get them down to 35 years in about 10 years from now. But if it doesn't take into account the reduction in discount rate to 7.5, then it may not get them all the way down where they need to be. Our conclusion, the recommendations that we made were primarily to keep a close eye on their assumptions going forward, making sure that they continually review those. But then we also, as we did with Beaumont, recommend that they work closely with their city in developing a written funding policy and a benefit policy that is self-referential and I'm not sure that's an actual phrase, but it takes into account risk sharing from both good and bad years.
Thank you. Questions for Kenny? Can you clarify the status of the FSRP, the response from the city?
Can I clarify the status?
Have we received it yet?
Yes, we did receive a copy of, it's in your board packet, it's the very last piece. So we.
You mean, okay, just this one, this page is it?
Yes, it's
okay. Thank you. So they've not taken these actions that they identify?
That's correct. So these are, as of the date of this letter, they are proposals that need to be taken to additional individuals in order for them to occur.
Thank you. Other questions for Kenny? If not, Kenny, thank you. I would ask for representatives of the city and the Fireman's Fund to please come forward. And please introduce yourselves. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Joey Dunnigan. I'm the current chair of the board.
Phil Burnett, I was a former chair, no longer active board member.
And I'm David Sawyer, I'm the fund's actuary.
Thank you. Would you all like to say anything before we begin questions?
Yeah, I'd like to just say that regarding the FSRP, that in that letter, that give you an update on what has and has not been done. We recently had an election of the membership to make the changes for the added tier to that, so that has gone through currently. The increase from the city is still in negotiations. We've had some recent city management changes, some retirees, so it's kind of slowed the process out a little bit. So, but we're still actively proceeding.
Thank you for that. Do I understand correctly that what the members voted on was that new hires would have a full retirement age of 53 rather than 50? And an increase in vesting from 10 to 20 years?
Correct.
That was all the members consented to?
Yes, that was the only election.
And also it says here the change in vesting applies to new hires only. And so those would not move the needle on the amortization period, is that right?
Not immediately, obviously, but over time, it would have some impact.
So to move the needle on the unfunded liability and the amortization period, the city would have to agree to increase more.
Yeah, that's correct.
And we're working with the city on that.
Right, and again, as mentioned earlier, there's already an agreement to lower the long-term rate of return to 7.5. We have priced out what the additional contribution rate would be to satisfy at that as well, but that part of it wasn't part of this FSRP. It's something that they're still negotiating with the city that they hope to obtain in the near future.
Thank you. One other question. Do you recall roughly what the effect actuarially was on increasing the vesting period from 10 years to 20? Was it material?
Again, that was just for new entrants only, so what we did was we did a forecast. And so we showed them what would happen if you hadn't made this change 5 and 10 years in the future, and then what happens if you did change it 5 and 10 years in the future, and we showed the impact. I think he could look it up. We've got the email or transmittal of that in here somewhere, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay, we don't have to know it right now, but we would be interested in that. I guess another way of phrasing that question is, how many people are leaving after 10 years and taking a benefit?
Okay, not a whole lot. They do have a significant amount of turnover, and they have historically, but most of that is in like the first 10 years, and of course, most of it's actually in the first 5 years.
Right.
So it probably isn't going to have a huge impact, but it did have some. It was enough that it was worth considering.
Mm-hmm. Questions for the representatives here?
Just continuing on that point, I mean, our concern on the vesting is just that if this is the primary retirement plan for these people, that making them stay for 20 to earn the benefit is a little rough. And that, sure, there's turnover and you want to reward those who stay, but if retirement security is one of the goals here, that's just a long time to wait to earn a benefit, especially for the leverage that it probably actually has on the cost numbers. I really appreciate you all coming today, and am heartened to see kind of some of the actions that proactive actions that you've taken, including tightening up funding policy by lowering discount rate, looking at other assumptions, making changes to the benefit side, pushing the city to increase contributions. Those are exactly the right things to be doing. So you to be commended for taking those actions. I worry a little bit if I look at the graph on page 15, just assets and liabilities. One of the things that I like to look at there, just to get an idea of how quickly this problem is accelerating, is look at the slopes of those two lines. And I'm really worried about, with this plan, even though it sounds like you're taking very good proactive steps that are important to making sure that you can close this gap, it does not, it looks like that gap is accelerating, and we've got to get those lines coming back together in the simplest terms. And I worry that even the very strong proactive steps that you've taken aren't going to get us there, that we're going to continue to see a widening of that gap over time. And that's kind of, I'm guessing that if you project it out, even with the changes to benefits and even with the lowering of the discount rate, if you get the 0.75 additional city contribution, that you would project that gap would get wider. And so that's just a tough situation to be in, and it may get wider at an increasing rate. And so it's a tough situation that you guys are in. You guys have a very low funded ratio. When you have a low funded ratio, it just means that the big movers for you are getting more money from members or the city, or reducing benefits in some way, and that's just both of those things are really hard tasks. But you gotta try to tackle it.
I think it's important to note that we understand that this is not the fix-all, that there's more steps that need to be taken, as you've just mentioned. But this is the first step, in a long-step process.
Do y'all have a sense for how aware the city is of the challenge that this fund faces? Have they acknowledged this?
It's an interesting time in the city. There's been some changes in the higher administration currently. So we're in the current board is in a re-education process with the new staff.
So in 2016, the difference between the ADC and the employer contribution rate was 5%. And the proposal is to provide some one-time, I think they're one-time vacancy monies in there, and then increase payroll by 3/4%. And so there's a 4+% gap that presumably is going to have to be made up either by some combination of the city and benefits cuts.
Yes, we understand that, and we are prepared to, like you said, to make further adjustments as necessary. This is the first step. We wanted to see where this, how far this gets us to be able to make necessary, to approach the city more, to let them know what additional changes are possible.
Right, that makes sense. Other questions from the committee?
Yeah, just to kind of, one of the things that you all, so I totally get that that you guys understand this is the first step, and I really appreciate you all kind of acknowledging that. The big concern on my mind is that sometimes that can cause us to delay action, so we want to figure out what's happened with what we've done, and we want to wait a few years. My big concern with your plan is if you look at the slope of liability, so how quickly liabilities are increasing, I'm guessing that they're increasing at a rate that is faster or the same, probably a little faster than your city's budget. And so this problem could grow relative to the city's budget, meaning that it's going to be harder to get enough money from the city to make up this deficit. And your liabilities are also going to be growing relative to payroll, which means it requires more hard sacrifices for members and for the city the longer you wait here. So that's a big concern for me is keep taking those steps, figure out what to do, just be honest about, how much you have to bend the liability or the asset curve to bring those back together, and acknowledge that if you wait longer, this could just get to a place where the pain is too much for your members and for the city, and it just makes the choices harder.
I think that's very helpful information. I think they've explained why the city members were not here. It's just kind of an unusual situation. It's unfortunate that they can't hear that. And they're committed to having these discussions and educating the new city staff. Is there anything the PRB could do to assist in that communication, or is that something that you typically aren't involved in? I mean, it just might be helpful for them to hear this, although I guess maybe we could share the recording if nothing else.
We'd be happy to work with, members of this committee would be happy to work with the, the staff to write a letter to whoever you all suggest, the city manager, the mayor, both, to articulate these issues.
And that might be something that we consider on an ongoing basis whenever we do reviews, is make sure that we send a formal letter to city staff that just lays out our recommendations and urges action on their part as well. That's a great recommendation.
I think that would give them a firmer stance to have these discussions. And
Yep.
I do believe that'd be very helpful, and we appreciate that offer.
Okay. Anything else that y'all would like to say right now?
I'd like to say thank you. I think this will give us more litness in our ability to negotiate with the city. And that's about all I have.
We very much appreciate y'all taking time to come down here today.
thank you.
Thank you very
And so I would consider a motion to recommend the review prepared by staff with amendments, if proposed, to the full board.
I make a motion to finalize a report for the full board with an amendment to bring the ADC into the body of the report. That's my motion.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. It passes unanimously. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, really appreciate it.
Okay, next item on the agenda is an update on the review of the Galveston Employees Retirement Plan for Police, and I would ask Anu to update us on that.
Members, behind tab 3, we have included the final draft of the Galveston Employees Retirement Plan for Police review, the intensive actuarial review that we had done and presented to the full board. Both the city as well as the plan had asked to come before this committee to provide an update on any progress they have made since the review back in January regarding addressing the funding shortfall that the plan is facing. You'll hear both from the city as well as from the police plan regarding the progress.
So I would ask representatives of the Galveston Police Fund and the city to please come forward. And please introduce yourselves. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Good morning. Yes, I'm Dan Buckley, Deputy City Manager for the City of Galveston.
I'm Jeff Gainer, I'm Chairman of the plan.
And I'm Dave Sawyer, I'm the actuary for the fund.
Thank you. Mr. Buckley, you have any prepared remarks?
Sure, I do. Good morning. Just for the record, Dan Buckley, Deputy City Manager for the City of Galveston. Also from the city, I have Sally Bacco, who is the city's legislative coordinator, and Mark Fenlaw, who is from Rudd and Wisdom, who was retained to perform a third-party evaluation of the plan for the city, present also. Let me first assure the committee members that the city remains committed to identifying a combination of funding and plan changes to return the plan to its long-term financial footing. Understanding, of course, that we don't control the pension board. It is an independent board, and the city is sort of along for the ride from that perspective. However, I think our presence here, both in January and now, is an indicator that we find it important for us to be here sitting at the table trying to find a way to resolve the problems. While the city waits for the plan's 2017 valuation, we've already taken some steps where council approved an increase in the city's contribution rate by about 15.5% from 12.83 to 14.83%. This is consistent with the budget that approved by council. We've identified some changes in the city's funding methodology, which could result in earlier and increased funding to the plan by funding vacancy and by funding earlier. Instead of dragging the funding out throughout the year at a per pay period, we could fund in advance, get the money into the plan and let it earn quicker. These are some of the things we come up with as we've independently worked awaiting the plan's results and our third-party review. Something that I'm going to do is I'm going to appoint an executive director from the city's finance department to sort of shepherd this process as we receive the actuarial report from the plan and our third-party review. I think it's best that we have an independent person that focuses on the plan, because this is the one plan we have left that we're trying to resolve. So if I can get it in a staff member's hands whose one of their primary responsibilities is to focus on this plan, I think that'll be a good thing. We're hopeful to, once we receive the plan's actuarial analysis, and it's anticipated, and Mr. Fenlaw is here, that probably 2 weeks following that we'll have our third-party valuation. Once the valuations are reviewed by both the city and the trustees, it's the city's position that we can then collectively work toward a long-term solution to the plan's financial problems. I'm here, as I said, to answer any questions and just provide you a brief update of what the city's done in the interim.
Thank you. Mr. Gaynor?
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I missed the January meeting. I had unexpected things come up, so I'm happy to be here, so thank you. Currently, as y'all know, the plan is being unfunded, or is being funded outside the parameters of the statute. The members of the plan are contributing 12%, while the normal cost of the plan is 11%, and the city's, as Mr. Buckley said, is paying 14.83%. However, The statutory contribution rate is 23.26%. That statutory rate is a combination of the interest on the unfunded liability, which is the interest rate is set by the assumed rate of return, which we've recently lowered from 8 to 7.5%. The municipality's normal cost, which in this case is zero because the normal cost is entirely covered by the members, and administrative costs, which is, last I checked, about 0.9%. The plan currently has $29 million in unfunded actuarial liability. To date, the plan has provided 6 different funding scenarios to help the city meet the obligations for their contributions. We offered different smoothing methods. We understand that on the statutory obligated scale, it's very front-loaded, and it goes down throughout time. I understand that it's a bit hard for a city to take on, so we offered maybe a 25-year smoothing where we could offset some of the financial burden in the beginning and spread it out throughout time. I'd really like to point out the fact that all of the necessary pieces to make this plan solvent tomorrow are already here. One of the big issues with the statutorily contribution schedule is that it kind of lends itself to an infinite amortization rate, only paying on the interest on the unfunded liability. However, we also have a collective bargaining agreement that sets a minimum funding level at 12%. With those two things combined, which don't negate each other but actually help each other, it puts a very definite amortization period in place. Once the statutory rate went below 12%, the minimum floor would kick in, and all of that money would go directly into paying down the principal, as you said. With just the pieces that are already in place through contract and the statute, we would be at 30 years tomorrow if we had the agreement. I mean, it would. I mean, we've run the numbers, and that's what it is. If we were to abide by the things that we already have in place, and I think that that's one of the more frustrating things about the negotiating process, is that we can't really settle on the rules because we need to settle on the rules before we start crunching the numbers as far as how we're going to handle things. I'd also like to point out that we have lowered our, as I said before, lowered our assumed rate of return from 8 to 7.5%. We will revisit that every year. No issues with continuing to lower that down, as far as whatever the actuary is providing. Our benefits are very bare-boned. We don't have a drop. We don't have a COLA. We have a 2.1% multiplier. It's a base pay only. You max at 30 years. As I said, we pay for 110% of it. There's not a whole lot of fat left to trim off of it, but we would certainly entertain anything that they have. But I will. That's all I have for you.
Thank you. Questions from the committee? Josh?
It sounds, I'm a little bit heartened that it sounds like there's more of an open communications channel, even though you guys aren't quite lovey-dovey yet. I'm guessing that's how you would characterize it too. I am heartened by that, though, that the city is taking this very seriously and is getting some third-party advice, is willing to dedicate staff time to working out a solution to this. Really appreciate that the plan has, run multiple scenarios, is very responsive, trying to find a solution to this. I don't quite fully understand how we could be, given what I'm seeing in the report and what I've heard, how we can get to a 30-year amortization period tomorrow. I'm guessing it could happen, but in my mind, looking at this, it seems like it's going to take a little more action than just the pieces that are in place today. Would be happy to have clarification on that point.
Sure. The report you have, is that the 2017 report? Well, when we first published this, it was unclear whether or not that the union negotiated 12% minimum was going to apply or not. So what that valuation of report's assuming is that city rate is just going to plummet down to, to nothing over time. But based on further discussions with the attorneys, it felt like that the statute and that 12% minimum do work together. And so if you reflect that, then all of a sudden the amortization period, which was reported last year at 45.7 years, would then drop down to close to the 30-year amortization period.
At the new discount rate?
Yes.
Okay. So I guess if I'm looking at the contribution rate, so 14.83 employer ADC, or 14.83 employer contribution from the city, so that's an increase for the city. And I'm seeing a 15.76 ADC. There's still a gap there for me. So help me understand how that works. How we get to 30 years when we're not hitting the ADC.
I'm sorry, where were you seeing the ADC at?
Sorry, page 11 of the report.
So staff has reported an ADC for the plan of about 15 3/4, with an employer contribution rate currently of just about 3% less than that, about 12 3/4.
They're up at 14.83 now.
So,
Go ahead.
I think that what's happening is, so with the statutory obligated rate going up to 23 and putting more money into the up front, and then having that 12, I think we hit the 12% minimum at 16 years. I'm just recalling it. So it offers a much lower, or it offers a better window, or maybe a similar window to the 30 years as far as smoothing it out throughout time. I think that the ADC was similar to when we did the smoothing method in one of our plans. It got down a little bit. I think it was like to about 19% when we smoothed it out over 25 years. If we smoothed it out over 30 years or 40 years, it'd probably get closer to the ADC that y'all have. If that helps answer your question.
Mr. Gaynor, did you say the normal cost of the plan is 11%?
For 2018,
Roughly?
at the new lower discount rate.
It went from 10.6 to 11, yes, sir.
And employees are contributing 12?
Yes, sir.
So employees are contributing greater than the normal cost?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Buckley, did you say that the city has commissioned a valuation of the plan, separate from the one Mr. Sawyer provides?
We have, yes.
And what is the purpose of that?
So that we can have a basis to start and compare to. We were a little surprised by the fact that evaluation was done last year. In preparation of the budget, as you all know, cities prepare annual budgets. Their valuation was done. We prepared our budget in concert with evaluation. As soon as the budget was approved, they performed another third-party review. They performed another valuation and hit us with another number. So it's best that the city get evaluation. Let's see if there's any differences. There's no one black box. It's the same. I don't think anybody's model is perfect. Let's see what the two models come up with. They may be very similar. They may be yards apart. And I think at that point we have to have that discussion to find out why we're apart, what's the best model. We need to look at the various alternatives that are available to us. But we wanted an independent review of it, and that's why the city did that. I think we also shared that with y'all last time that we were doing that, and we're encouraged to do that.
I inferred from what you said that the city might be looking at potential cuts in benefit levels.
The city can't control that, sir.
I understand. What can the city control?
Nothing. On that pension, absolutely nothing.
But the contribution rate you can control.
It's negotiated in the collective bargaining agreement. So that's done by the GMPA. GMPA is the union that represents the police officers in the city of Galveston. I heard that in one of your earlier presentations that was also an issue. I think that's an issue that they just don't go hand in hand. That's the problem.
This is a point that I think is worth making. If you send them more money, they're not going to send it back.
That's right.
So, while it's negotiated, I think that's right, but you're trying to negotiate a lower amount, and I think...
Not necessarily so. The city, through all the contracts, it's been a negotiated rate of 12%. The city's complied with that throughout history. This last time, in recognition of the fact that there were problems with this plan and we need to put more money in, we changed the verbiage to say we could put at a minimum, so we knew that we recognized that we were going to put more money in. We're doing that, but when you look back historically, you've got to look at the issues. We provided a letter, which I think Anu got, and I hope it was shared with all you, where we really talk about the issues on the plan. You can look back. History isn't going to do much for us. We need to figure out how to fix it going forward. We're a believer that it's going to take a collective effort, the two. I think the best thing we can do is get the best information. We get 2 actuarial reports. If there isn't a big difference between those, we know we have a good basis to start from. and then we sit down collectively and talk. One of the things that didn't come up is one of the big variables in it is retirement age, 45, remarkably low.
It's 50. It's early retirement, it's 45. You take a substantial hit.
When do you expect the city's evaluation to be?
2 weeks after we receive the one from the plan.
So it's an audit?
Mark, what would you call it?
It's an audit with the replication of the valuation as part of it.
Thank you. Other questions? You were going to say something, Mr. Gaynor. Do you recall what you were going to say?
Just about it being a negotiated rate, and I was just going to bring up the fact that you obviously can put in more than what is in the contract, more than what is being put in the contract is being put in right now. The GMPA doesn't have anything to do other than to negotiate the floor, which I really think is where the negotiation needs to take place. That floor, in conjunction with the statute, is, I mean, the board doesn't have any control over it. We obviously have to come to the table with the city. Where that floor is determines our amortization rate, good, bad, or indifferent. And the lower that floor is, obviously, the more we have to, the more cuts the plan has to take in raising it up. I know that that's where the attention lies, and given all of the other structures that are involved, I was just going to make that point.
Thank you. Josh?
I was just going to make the point, we didn't mean to make your negotiation any harder. My point was more, hey, you guys are going in the right direction. Let's keep that going. Let's not lose momentum on that. I feel like the gulf between you guys in January was kind of like your assets and liabilities, and we need both to close to actually solve this problem.
And I think you can credit that to Mr. Gaynor, who's to my left. He brought a new perspective. I think we're going to get there. It's just going to. It didn't happen overnight. It's not going to be fixed overnight. The biggest concern is the amount of money they're talking about would be about 5 cents on the city's tax rate. That takes a vote of the citizens to get there. That's just not money that's available to the city through its general fund. So I mean, there's got to be different ways to slice and dice and get there. We want the pension to be good, viable, and strong, and that's where we're going to work towards.
I appreciate that. My one concern in all of this is when we start talking about smoothing and different ways to slice and dice, I wish that we could just cut out creative solution from the lexicon of policy, because I get really worried whenever I start hearing about creative solutions.
I talk slice and dice, I'm talking about, do we pre-fund, do you lump sum, do you increase contributions over a gradual term, or start high and build down? That's what I'm talking about. Just to make sure the terms I use aren't one that give you concerns.
Mr. Buckley, at the last meeting in January, you indicated that you all had been directed by the city council or the city manager to strike a compromise with the plan to get the plan fully funded over the long term. Have you all made any proposals to that end, or is the extent of your actions the commissioning of a valuation and replication?
No, as I said earlier, what we've done is we increased our contribution by 2%, 15.5%. There's a 2% increase, which reflects a 15.5% increase. We did that since we last met. We've also identified pre-funding that we can do going forward. So we have all those things available to us, and we're going to take those unilateral actions. They don't have anything to do with the negotiation. We just think they're things that will help the strength of the plan. But we have not had discussions because we're waiting for the financial results. We can't start from a number from an old actuarial report and then find out that we don't have a good number. So we'll get the good numbers and we'll go from there.
And when do we expect the next valuation from your firm, sir?
Within the next week.
Okay, and you're saying 2 weeks after that.
Yeah, mid-May.
So can we ask the PRB staff to work with you all to come back again after we've gotten all these numbers and see where we'll go from here?
When we did, just a point of reference, we did this with the fire department. It's about a 6-month process after we got the numbers. So if you have us back in 90 days, I'll tell you we may not have it resolved. It took 6 months with the fire department.
Okay. Is there anything else any of you gentlemen would like to say to this committee right now?
Well, just I would make sure this is clear, is that when we issue this report, we're directed by the board to assume that the city is going to follow the statutory rate. So this contribution rate here, isn't isn't the 14.83, or isn't even the
It's
12
in
point.
violation of the collective bargaining agreement, too.
So we
So
have,
this is the big, elephant in the room, is where to go with this
And that's the inherent
divide.
problem in the system, in the process. The legislation that set it up, established it, city has all the liability and has no control. That's a broken system.
Well, it's a very simple system. It just needs an addition problem. And the actuary acts at the direction of the statute and the collective bargaining agreement. They work symbiotically, not as opposing forces, especially to make a good amortization period. So he has to work off of law and contract, and he can't just make assumptions and guess as to what the city's going to do. So we had him draw up a plan based upon the statute and collective bargaining agreement.
Josh?
I was just going to say, I thought they were playing nice.
Well, I think maybe we're getting to the heart of the matter here. If Mr. Fenlaw's results come back with a actuarially determined contribution rate of, say, 15%, is the city willing to honor that?
I think that's a number that would be necessary. Is that the city's obligation? I'm not sure. Again, collective bargaining trumps all. Every other state law, every other local ordinance, collective bargaining is the driving force. The directive I have from our general counsel is that collective bargaining is the primary. You can get caught up in everything else, but there is nothing else other than collective bargaining when it exists. I think that we have to sit down and figure out how to get there. The city is willing and no doubt about want to get the plan back on sound footing. It's just going to take collective work. I can't commit to a number to you. No, sir.
Is this at the state level, the litigation, the contributions?
The collective bargaining unit?
Collective bargaining.
Yeah, that's a state law. It's in the local government code, and that trumps all other state law and ordinances.
It trumps
Is it
Chapter
one law
143
for all the
issues, but
state,
not-
all the cities in the state, or
Yes,
for?
sir.
It's civil service as well.
It's different. I mean, I was dumbfounded. I think last time I was here, y'all queried me pretty extensively, so y'all are violating state law, you're violating state law. Well, that's not the case according to our general counsel. And until this last contract, the contract had a definitive amount, 12%, 12%, 12%. We negotiated a change last time because we knew this was coming. We knew that there's going to have to be additional funding into the plan, so we changed it to a minimum of. That never existed before that.
And I think it'd be interesting to see whatever that is, because we've provided all of the legal documents that show what's happening, and we haven't gotten back anything to say that that shouldn't be followed.
So I think, from my perspective, and Mr. Brunner may not agree, but I think he does, that, we agree that this is a convoluted legal situation, and there's tons of room to disagree, because state law, collective bargaining, and city ordinance are all at play. And how we ended up in that situation, who knows? But somebody flubbed it a little bit to end up in kind of disagreement across all three of those. And I understand that you guys are in a negotiation, and so there are negotiating positions. Our job is to look at the actual numbers and say, hey, that's got to get closed. So I would encourage you, I hear negotiating positions coming out now, and those are great. But at the end of the day, we've got to have a solution to this. And that's, regardless of what state law says or what the city is legally responsible for, regardless of what the statutory contribution rate is, we've got to find a way to get more money into the plan to square assets and liabilities here. And so I would just encourage you, in the past, I was somewhat discouraged that there were lots of negotiating positions coming out without too much movement on the actual meat of what was necessary. I was encouraged to see that you guys were starting to talk about the numbers and what would actually take to close. I think you're on much firmer ground there than trying to fall back on legal positions. So I would encourage you to look at these numbers, be honest with each other about what it's going to take, and try to find a solution to this, even though I know it's going to be a negotiation.
Thank you for that. Mr. Buckley, will you share the results of Mr. Fenlaw's work with the plan and with the Pension Review Board?
Absolutely.
Would you?
The idea is, as soon as we get it, we're going to give it to them, and then we're going to sit down collectively and look at the two, see if there's differences, see if we can reconcile the differences. If there's a vast difference, and, that's a different discussion. I don't know where they're going to be, but I think the results will give us a basis to start to have the negotiations and move forward from there.
And would you be so kind as to forward those results as well to the PRB?
Mhm.
Other questions from the committee?
Just that I agree with us having them back at some point. It's not clear to me that it would be nice to see the results of their two actuarial reports. And it may be worthwhile to talk to them in a shorter time period if there's a huge gulf between those actuarial reports, and just to kind of get an update. If they're pretty close and it's all about kind of negotiating internally, then we may put it off until the fall, is kind of my preference. I don't know what the rest of the committee thinks.
Come whenever you want us, sir.
We are not
Sounds
slated for
fine.
action on this item. Are we allowed to take action?
We are not, but certainly the committee can take action on this particular item. We are looking at potentially an early September committee meeting, and we have a June board meeting that's already set, so those are the two.
Okay, so I think September sounds more realistic than June. Should I entertain a motion to ask these folks to come back with all of the material that's available at the September meeting?
Sure. You
Okay.
can say the next, actually.
Mr. Chairman, one thing we'll do is we'll provide that to staff on a flow basis. You okay with that? Yeah, and we'll just, as we get it, we'll just forward it on to your staff, keep y'all involved in where we're at, provide updates. That may, we may be making strong progress at that point, I don't know, but we'll be glad to come back anytime you want us. And in the interim, we'll provide you all the information.
Okay, thank you. I would expect that we'll see you at the next meeting of this committee. Anything else that y'all wish to say right now?
When would that be?
Probably in early September.
So do we need a motion?
No, I think we can just.
Okay, thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is discussion, consideration of actuarial review metrics, and I would ask Kenny to please come forward.
Good afternoon, members. If I can direct you to tab 4. It is an updated copy of the plan review metrics spreadsheet that we put together. You had requested at the last committee meeting that we add a form of variance from the mean for the various metrics that are included in here. What we have selected at this point is just the difference. So it is the value of the metric minus the average of the plans that are in that column. One that we did not include was the drop as a percentage of the financial net position, simply because it's such a small number of plans that are included. We didn't feel it was useful. We have also highlighted, as requested, the plans that are currently under review, as well as the plans that were completed. So the blue are the completed plans already. Don't have any additional prepared remarks as far as that's concerned. It's just a matter of discussing whether this is what you were looking for, and any additional potential changes that you're interested in seeing.
Thank you. Comments, questions from the committee? These are, for the benefit of the audience, these are metrics that this committee and the Pension Review Board has been looking at for some time. A couple of meetings ago, we settled on these particular metrics. What is new this time is an effort to mathematically try to continue to refine these numbers, in this case by identifying the distance from the average to get a sense for, to more easily be able to identify outliers in each of these categories, such as the funded ratio, the unfunded liability as percentage of payroll, and so forth. And the staff has helpfully applied some color coding to this, which I find on the whole to be helpful in identifying which plans are outliers and which are not. Comments or questions from the committee?
It's fine.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, Kenny. This looks great. It's very helpful to see distance from the mean. I find it very helpful.
You've also included national averages for 5 of the 8 factors at the bottom of the...
Right, so at the bottom, I did mention this, we have included the standard deviation. We had considered looking at, showing the standard deviation, but in some of these metrics, it really doesn't provide a whole lot of use when they're clustered around a small number. And then the national averages that we've included are calculated from the public plans data. I think it's publicplansdata.org or publicplanssurvey.org.
Public Plans Database?
Yes.
Yeah. Maintained by the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College?
Correct, yes.
Got it. And these averages are by plan?
I'm sorry.
Their plan is the unit of analysis?
Yes.
Okay.
So I don't hear a desire to make any changes to this schedule at this point. Is it safe to say that we'll stay with this for the time being? This method of reporting these metrics to this committee? Everyone okay with that?
Yes.
Pending further review and changes, possibly. Okay, thank you for your work on this, Kenny and Anu. Next item is an update on the actuarial valuation of the Lufkin Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund. I would ask Anu to brief us on that, please.
Members, at the March board meeting, staff had discussed the 2016 actuarial valuation for the Lufkin Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund. We had more specifically identified that there was a difference in the active liabilities calculated as of the 2014 and 2016 valuations due to change in actuarial firms. We, on a staff level, had requested the Lufkin Fire Board to clarify or provide additional information to help us identify the reasons behind those differences. However, even though under this governing statute of the Pension Review Board, as part of our mandate, we are required to conduct continuing reviews and can request clarifying information. The board is required to adopt rules before we can request clarifying information from our systems, and since the PRB does not have those rules adopted yet, at this time the staff is recommending that we include the 2016 Rudd and Wisdom actuarial data for the Lufkin Fire Fund in our reports with a footnote discussing the discrepancy, and moving forward that the PRB adopt the required rules under our statute to request clarifying information from the funds in the future if need be.
Thank you. Questions for Anu on this issue pertaining to Lufkin Firemen's, but also having wider application for the operations of the PRB?
The rules, would we have to, are we adopting them specifically whenever we do an intensive review? Are we adopting those rules relative to an FSRP? What would those rules pertain to?
So the statute gives the Pension Review Board the authority to adopt rules regarding its general duties, which includes conducting reviews, conducting intensive studies. The idea is if the PRB is requesting our funds to provide information, it should be done through rulemaking. And in that regard, the statute does allow the Pension Review Board to adopt rules surrounding its general duties of providing technical assistance, conducting reviews, conducting intensive studies. And when we visit that, hopefully sometime next year, those could be either specific to certain projects that the PRB undertakes, or could have a much wider implication where we adopt rules surrounding the ongoing reviews that the PRB conducts.
Is there any value, so I know that without rules, we've been declined on this request, a couple of times now?
Correct.
And there is a substantial difference in the numbers that we're trying to explain. Lufkin is subject to FSRP. Is that accurate?
Yes, you're correct. So
It's subject to the
would
FFRP
have
statute.
been, you're right. Because of the differences, had the 2016 valuation not had those differences, they would have potentially been subject to the FSRP.
Got it. Is there any, I understand that we can't force them, is there any value of sending kind of one final formal request and then leaving it at that, telling them that we request the data, we would be much more comfortable under our statutory duty if we could rectify the difference or provide some understanding of the difference to the legislature, understanding that if they decline this request, that we will add a footnote into the final report that will indicate, is there value in taking that approach, just kind of one final, here's what we're going to do type formal letter?
That's up to the committee. Up
Bob.
until now, we have, on a staff level, been making those requests.
Bob?
Yeah, just what is how many times have we already gone out for an opinion on this matter? I mean, he's bringing up a point, and I don't know whether, it seems like we've been out there letting people know what we want for quite a while.
Anu, have we asked Lufkin already?
Yes, we have asked them thrice.
Have we sent them a formal letter?
No, we have not.
It's been a staff to
Correct. It's been on a staff level that we've
email,
made
phone
those
call type
requests.
basis?
Correct. But the Lufkin Fire Board has taken formal actions to consider our request on a staff level and essentially denied, because they have confidence in the number that Rudd and Wisdom has put together. And we are by no means questioning Rudd and Wisdom's numbers, of course, but.
So, and the course of action that I'm suggesting we at least consider is that we just send them a formal letter from whatever the committee or the board that says, we still would like to have this information, here's why. So make that formal, the why we're requesting it. That might be useful in our rulemaking process. Say if we don't hear a positive response by our June board meeting, we're going to finalize and move forward with a footnote and just kind of formalize exactly what our response is to that. And maybe that is part of our how we approach the rulemaking in the future.
Well, my dilemma in this is, have we already done enough, I guess is the way I would express it. And absent a legal position that we would, if we had a legal position we were following, we would already have what we needed to go forward. We don't have that. We've tried 3 times.
Right.
I think 3 times is enough for me.
Josh, I appreciate what you're trying to do. Falls into the category of due diligence. Seems to me that by taking formal action, the Lufkin board has clearly stated their intent. We can put this information, this discussion, the past valuation, all in the record. And my suggestion would be like Bob's, and that is just to accept their decision and move forward.
I'm fine with that, but just note that this is a pretty simple request, a low dollar amount request, and this is a plan. And I understand the rulemaking piece, but this is a plan ignoring a request from the board that is a pretty simple thing to fill because they don't want to do it, and it's material to our statutory duty. And so that's my concern here, and it sets a little bit of a precedent. So that's the only reason to consider a formal letter. You said due diligence. I think, I think that's right under our statutory authority, and I just worry that kind of sets a precedent that if we make a reasonable request, and maybe the rulemaking will solve this, but if we make a reasonable request and a plan decides they just don't want to mess with us, they can just not mess with us.
But we it seems to me we would be sending a message out to our groups, all of that's a harder position on our part. Are we making? Is it too much? Is it? or the people out there that we work with, we need a good relationship with them. Maybe we should say this will have nothing to do with the relationship, but maybe it would. So that makes me cautious here.
Yeah, and I agree with that caution, Bob. But I think that the approach that I outlined is saying, hey, we understand your position, here's our position, we're going to move forward, we're not going to try to force your hand on this. So it's a pretty soft position, just kind of explaining where we're coming from formally and saying exactly how we're going to handle it going forward. So I'm not saying that we should find a way to officially force their hand. It's more just saying, here's how we're approaching it, here's why we did it this way, and we're going to move forward if you don't respond. And so just kind of documenting that. But I understand the position that, we may want to just move forward as well. I just worry about the precedent that it sets.
Okay, I think that we will take no action on this item. Anything else on this item?
Not at this time.
Thank you.
Staff will go ahead and the discussion that's transpired here today, of course, will be reflected in our minutes, and staff will go ahead and start including Lufkin Fire's 2016 AV data in our reports moving forward with a footnote explaining the discrepancy.
Thank you. Date and location of next meeting of this committee.
We haven't polled the members yet, but we were hoping or looking at early September for the next actuarial committee meeting. So staff will have time to select the next round of plans for reviews and come back with those reports at the next meeting.
Okay, that's great.
But the committee is not doing anything at the board meeting and.
At the next board meeting, we will be presenting the final reviews that was discussed, the reviews that were discussed here today.
Good.
Okay, this is an invitation for audience participation. If anyone would like to address this group, this is your opportunity. We'd love to hear from you. Please approach the podium. Seeing no one, hearing no one, we will move. I would entertain a motion for adjournment.
I so move.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here.